Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was the most brilliant general of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Architect of the victory over Japan in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, he would save his homeland in the Battle of Moscow, change the course of the war in the Battle of Stalingrad, and deliver the final blow to the Third Reich in the Battle of Berlin. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born on the 1st of December of 1896 in Strelkovka, a town in the Kaluga district, then part of the Russian Empire. Coming from a very poor family, his father was a shoemaker named Konstantin Zhukov, and his mother, a farmer named Ustinina Aktemievna. He had an older sister, Maria Zhukov, and a brother, Alexei Zhukov. Because his family faced considerable economic hardship, Zhukov had to begin working at the age of 8 to help pay the rent for their home, which consisted of a humble ground floor dwelling with just one room and a dirt floor. Fortunately, he was able to receive an education while working, as he attended evening classes where he learned to read and write, as well as other subjects such as history, and in particular, military affairs, which became a special passion of his. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Zhukov enlisted in the cavalry of the Imperial Russian Army at the age of 18. With no difficulties in his enrollment, in 1915, he was assigned to the 10th Novgorod Dragoon Regiment before being sent to the Eastern Front, where he distinguished himself in combat, earning promotion to sergeant and being awarded the Cross of St. George for his bravery. When the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in October of 1917, the Provisional Government of Alexander Kerensky ordered the horsemen of the 10th Novgorod Dragoon Regiment to charge against the revolutionary workers and peasants. However, Zhukov's unit, sympathetic to Vladimir Lenin's ideas, refused to obey the order and joined the rebels. As a result, he was appointed by his fellow soldiers as delegate of the Regimental Soviet. From that moment, he fought alongside the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, taking command of the 3rd Cossack Regiment from 1918 to 1921, and being promoted to brigade commander that same year. Among his notable contributions to the conflict was the crushing of the Tambov Rebellion in 1921, where he distinguished himself by defeating the socialist peasants who had risen against the Bolsheviks. Once the Russian Civil War ended in 1924 with the Red Army's victory and the founding of the Soviet Union, Zhukov left active service to study at the Frunze Military Academy. A few years later, he graduated from the Higher Cavalry School, and in 1933 he was appointed military inspector with the rank of general. The following year, in 1934, he took command of the 4th Cavalry Division, while in 1938, after surviving Joseph Stalin's Great Purge, during which his comrade Mikhail Tukhachevsky was executed, he was given command of the Belarusian military district. Outside of military life, General Georgy Zhukov also formed his own family, first marrying Alexandra Zhuikova, a marriage that would end in divorce, and later Galina Alexandrova, a doctor with whom he would share the rest of his life. Regarding his descendants, Zhukov had a total of 4 daughters named Era, Margarita, Ella, and Maria. At the beginning of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in the summer of 1939 between the Soviet Union and Outer Mongolia against Japan and Manchukuo, General Georgy Zhukov, still unknown to many Soviets, was sent to the Far East to prevent the Japanese from penetrating Mongolian territory. Miraculously, and against all odds, the young officer, in whom no one in his own ranks had placed any faith, stopped the advance of the Imperial Japanese Army along a front of 750 kilometers and prepared a meticulous counterattack by transferring large reserves from the rear, moving his men at night to avoid suspicion, and having his own troops study a manual he himself had written, entitled What the Soviet Soldier Must Know in Defense. Thus, on the 20th of August of 1939, Zhukov's Red Army launched an offensive that easily overran enemy positions, broke through the Manchurian border, and destroyed the 11th Japanese Army in the Nomohan Pocket. That unexpected victory, which inflicted 50,000 casualties on the Japanese at the cost of 26,000 Soviet losses, resulted in a peace treaty with Japan and the awarding of the Medal of Hero of the Soviet Union to Zhukov. With the situation in the Far East resolved, Zhukov took part in the invasion of Bessarabia against Romania in 1940, leading the Red Army against the few Romanian forces who were easily defeated. In the following months and early in 1941, Zhukov began to suspect the possibility of a war against Germany, which is why he proposed to Joseph Stalin both defensive measures on the border and even a preemptive strike. 2 proposals that failed, since the Soviet leader was absolutely convinced of his friendship with Adolf Hitler. On the 22nd of June of 1941, more than 4 million Axis soldiers invaded the Soviet Union in what became known as Operation Barbarossa. Astonishingly, Stalin himself believed it was merely a temporary tantrum of Hitler with whom he could reach an agreement. Something Zhukov tried to show was a mistake during a heated verbal confrontation that ended badly, since the Soviet leader, convinced of his thesis, lost 3 weeks of precious time during which millions of Red Army troops fell. Unfortunately, by the time Stalin realized his error and appointed Zhukov as a member of the General Staff, Stavka, the defeat of Kiev had already occurred, costing 1 million Soviet casualties and bringing the German army close to Moscow. Fortunately, Zhukov's advice, such as reinforcing the Arctic sector against Finland in Karelia, organizing partisans in the rear, and delaying 150,000 German soldiers for several days at the Battle of Smolensk, prevented a total collapse of the Eastern Front. Moscow became the final objective of the German army, Wehrmacht, before its ultimate victory over the USSR. And for that reason, General Zhukov convinced Stalin that the decisive battle had to be fought around the capital. Thus, after 700,000 Soviet soldiers were annihilated in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets, Zhukov managed to delay the enemy's advance long enough to mobilize the entire population of Moscow in the construction of defenses and take advantage of the winter, which covered the roads with snow and froze the German machinery. Thanks to this tactic, the Soviets gained 2 months of time and transferred from the Far East the Siberian Army to launch a counteroffensive on the 5th of December of 1941, when the enemy was only 16 kilometers from the capital. In this way, Zhukov crushed the German vanguards and captured numerous prisoners, pushing the army group north back more than 140 kilometers from the city and emerging as the victor of the Battle of Moscow, thus becoming the first general to defeat the German army on land in the Second World War. When Army Group South launched Operation Blue against the USSR, which brought Axis forces into half of the Caucasus and locked them into the Battle of Stalingrad, a bloody urban war lasting from the summer until the autumn of 1942, Marshal Georgy Zhukov took command of the Red Army on the far side of the Volga River, while secretly assembling a massive force of 1,101,000 soldiers, 675 tanks, 10,250 guns, and 1,216 aircraft. Under the name Operation Uranus, on the 19th of November, he launched a pincer counteroffensive that destroyed the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, and on the 21st his vanguards linked up at Sovietsky, encircling the German 4th Army inside Stalingrad itself. Following this maneuver, Zhukov tightened the siege of the city and launched further offensives, which also destroyed the Italian 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army along the Don River. Under this pressure, and subjected to hunger and the harsh winter climate, the soldiers of the German 6th Army finally surrendered on the 2nd of February of 1943. This disaster, which cost the Axis 800,000 casualties at the price of 1,200,000 Soviet losses, was Zhukov's greatest military triumph to that date and the key turning point that shifted the course of the Second World War. Obsessively, the Third Reich returned to the offensive in the summer of 1943 in what became known as Operation Citadel, in a sector between Kursk and Orel, for which Georgy Zhukov, recently promoted to Field Marshal, was responsible. Since Zhukov had already anticipated a movement in that area, he organized a formidable horseshoe-shaped defense composed of dense minefields, trench networks, explosive traps, and a significant reserve of armored units. Thus unfolded the Battle of Kursk, considered the largest tank battle in history, in which, although the Soviets suffered far greater casualties due to the introduction of the new Tiger and Panther tanks, which outclassed the Russian T-34, the losses inflicted by Zhukov on the Germans forced them to abandon the offensive and yield the initiative to the Red Army. Thanks to the victory in the Battle of Kursk, Zhukov pursued the German army through Ukraine, recovering a considerable stretch of lost territory such as the cities of Orel or Kharkov, crossing the Dnieper River, and liberating the capital of Kiev in December of 1943. He also organized the breaking of the siege of Leningrad in 1944, after expelling the Finnish German besiegers, and regained much of Western Russia, which earned him the nicknames given by his soldiers such as Savior, Spasitel, Battering Ram, Hurricane, or Invincible. Under the name Operation Bagration, on June 22nd of 1944, Marshal Georgy Zhukov organized the largest offensive of the Red Army in the Second World War, with 2,331,000 soldiers, 4,070 tanks, 31,000 cannons or mortars, and 6,339 airplanes. In this way, buried first by the initial artillery bombardment and then overwhelmed by Russian tanks and infantry, The German troops suffered one of their greatest defeats due to the 400,000 casualties compared to the 765,000 of the Red Army, as well as the territorial loss of Belarus, eastern Poland, western Ukraine, and Lithuania. At the beginning of 1945, Georgy Zhukov launched the final offensive against the heart of the Third Reich, first expelling the Germans from the Vistula River and Warsaw, then conquering Poland and East Prussia, and finally entering the German borders. However, from that point onward, Joseph Stalin tried to obtain personal political gains from the campaign, and therefore recklessly encouraged competition among his three favorite marshals. Zhukov in command of the First Belarusian Front, Ivan Konev of the First Ukrainian Front, and Konstantin Rokossovsky of the Second Belarusian Front. This absurd decision by Stalin cost thousands of Soviet lives in the crossing of the Oder River and the capture of the Silo Heights, although in the long run, it favored Zhukov because, after the activation of Order 11,074, the Marshal was the first to begin the Battle of Berlin, conquer the city, and finally raise the red flag of the USSR over the German parliament, Reichstag, on May 2nd of 1945. Once the Second World War in Europe ended in May of 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was one of the highest-ranking military leaders to preside over the Victory Parade in Red Square in Moscow, held on June 10th. However, Joseph Stalin, fearing that Zhukov would become too popular among the Russian people to the detriment of his own figure, overshadowed the Marshal's fame through an intense and falsified propaganda campaign by which the Soviet leader himself claimed the laurels of triumph over Germany. As a reward for his services in the Second World War, Stalin appointed Zhukov head of the High Commission of Germany, which oversaw the eastern part of the country, a post in which he strengthened ties with the United States, Great Britain, and France, and also met with important figures such as the American General David Eisenhower, the English Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and the French General Jean de La Tassigny. Little by little, Zhukov's fame grew not only among Russians, but also among the Western Allies. This greatly worried Stalin, as there was a risk that the Soviet people might see Zhukov as the victor of the war rather than himself. For that reason, he removed Zhukov from his responsibilities in Germany, and to everyone's surprise, gave him military command of the Ural district. However, rather than a reward, his new post was more of a punishment, and Zhukov himself considered it an unjust forced exile. After Stalin's death in 1953 and the beginning of the de-Stalinization process, under the new president Georgy Malenkov, the new authorities transferred Zhukov from the Urals and stationed him in Moscow to prevent a highly probable coup d'etat by Lavrenti Beria, at that time Stalin's most loyal follower, who aspired to succeed him. Immediately, Zhukov, in command of the Red Army in the capital, managed to bring the entire state police, NKVD, under his control and arrested Beria, who would later be tried, with Zhukov testifying before the court, and executed, thus bringing an end to the Stalinist era. In 1955, Zhukov was appointed Minister of Defense of the USSR under the new cabinet of President Nikolai Bulganin. During his time in this post, he supported opening relations with the West, which is why he met again with his old acquaintance, the American David Eisenhower, recently elected President of the United States, to whom he gave a fishing kit. At the same time, he reinforced ties with other communist countries, for example, through a voyage aboard the cruiser Kuibyshev to Albania and Yugoslavia, where he visited leaders Enver Hoxha and Josip Tito, respectively. He also supported the trials to restore the memory of all of Stalin's victims, including several of his comrades who had been murdered during the Great Purge, such as Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Nikita Khrushchev, the new secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, CPSU, removed Zhukov from the Ministry of Defense in 1957. A decade later, in 1965, he was called again by the cabinet of President Leonid Brezhnev, while the following year, in 1966, he was awarded the Order of Lenin in a tumultuous ceremony in Red Square. Unexpectedly, in 1967, Zhukov suffered a cerebrovascular health problem that forced him to leave active service permanently and retire due to illness. From then on, he was treated at home by his wife, Dr. Galina Alexandrova, leading a very peaceful and domestic life in which he engaged in activities such as answering the many letters of his military admirers or writing a work he titled Memoirs and Battles, published in 1969. On June 18th of 1974, the life of Georgy Zhukov came to an end forever, and his body was subsequently buried with full national honors in the mausoleum of Red Square in Moscow. With him passed one of the greatest heroes of the Soviet Union, and without a doubt one of the most brilliant military leaders of the Second World War,